Are you at all interested in philosophers' work on consciousness? I've never asked a neuroscientist this question, but in other areas like physics or mathematics, I have the sense that many people sort of resent or maybe look down on philosophers meddling in their work. Is that I don't want to start this off negatively or with charge here, but how do you think about philosophers working in mind, I guess, consciousness, if you can put it broadly?
First of all, I would say I actually have a background in physics, and I studied physics as an undergrad. And I even not only took physics and math classes, I even took philosophy of physics classes. And the whole thing is very interesting. And of course, neuroscience has a lot of roots in philosophy. I would say first that people who dismiss philosophy don't know the history, because science is philosophy. It's a branch of philosophy, and it came out of philosophy. And my feeling is in physics, philosophy is really just an attempt to understand the concepts and to get away from the specifics of the math. And yet you still have to have the math to understand the concepts. And so the philosophy and the physics are really meshed together. And I think that's true in consciousness as well. They're really meshed together. I think there are a lot of philosophical perspectives on consciousness, some of which I absolutely do not agree with and think are completely silly, but some I do agree with. So I don't see the divide as being between science and philosophy on this one. In fact, many of the philosophers are just as scientific, meaning empirical and data-driven, as the scientists. Many of the scientists are just as philosophical, meaning conceptual, as the philosophers. I see the divide more between what I would call the magicalists, the people who essentially believe there's a magic essence, and how do we explain it, and the more rationalist perspective, which doesn't resort to the magic. And there are philosophers on both sides of that. So I mean, I've definitely spoken to philosophers of consciousness. I don't think you can go into that field without encountering a lot of the philosophical perspectives.
Mm-hmm. So maybe a good distinction to be drawn here is that between good and bad philosophy. So I think Stephen Hawking, since we were talking about physics, he notably said that philosophy is dead, but presumably he just didn't know enough about philosophy to tell the good philosophers from the bad philosophers, because keeping with physics, there are plenty of terrific philosophers of physics who work very closely with physicists and have an eye on the empirical data. And I mean, the same is true with philosophy of mind and consciousness. There are philosophers who are very data driven.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. I mean, I think that anyone who's ever thought about the larger implications of their work is a philosopher. And so Stephen Hawking was a philosopher, even though he may have disliked them. He essentially was one. And there are people who read my work and say, oh, okay, he's a philosopher, which I find interesting. I will say there is a difference in the fields as they stand right now that I find intriguing. It seems to me that the bottom line in science is data. Can you get data that shows what you're talking about? And in philosophy, interestingly, in terms of career, in terms of success as a philosopher, the bottom line is, can you win an argument? And those are really different things. And very often I find philosophers have a certain, professional philosophers have a certain magnetic attraction to argument structure that, or sophistry, or attempts to convince people in ways that are more linguistic tricks than actual substance. And the field lends itself a little bit more to that, because the bottom line in terms of career success is, can you win an argument? That's very different in science. It doesn't matter whether you win the argument or not. All that matters is the data that you produce in the end.
Exactly. Yeah. And just to touch on something you said a couple of minutes ago, I think that your work that I've read is very philosophical. I mean, you have to be philosophical to engage with people like David Chalmers or Daniel Dennett, because you're on their turf in a sense when you bring up concepts. and you're talking about these concepts quite deeply, just as you said with philosophy of physics. It's about the concepts without having to get as much into the math.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I certainly talked extensively to both of those people, to David Chalmers and Daniel Dennett, many times.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked about your work on consciousness yet, but it seems like Daniel Dennett would be very sympathetic to it.
Yes, absolutely. I think my work represents a specific theory in the general landscape that Daniel Dennett likes to inhabit. And yeah.